This is my electric tapping machine, and while I really like it, it's got one kind of problem, and that's that the base needs to be bolted or clamped down to a table. Today I'm going to solve that using this lifting magnet. So by taking out these screws in the top of the lifting magnet, I'm going to be able to use the existing holes as a mounting point for this piece of steel plate that's going to hold the base of the tapping arm. If you're not familiar with the tapping arm, I did a video on it recently, and basically what it is a servo drive machine that you can use to go forward and reverse and tap metal parts. It's really helpful. It's helped me make a lot of money, and I want to make it a little more mobile in my shop. Now, magnetic bases for these types of tools exist, but they're really expensive, so I decided to make this one myself, and it's probably only going to cost me about $100. So I trace out where I want the magnetic base to kind of be, where I want the base of the tapping arm to be, and then I'm going to use a little square to just sort of use this scrap plate and make it a little more ergonomic and make it a little bit smaller. I had previously tried to plasma cut this, and I guess it didn't work out. So now I'm just going to use the metal cutting circular saw to clip these corners and make it a little closer to that round shape. Now this is a pretty thick piece of plate, and I want it to be so that there is less flex and less deflection on it. But those tapped holes in the top of the magnetic lifting arm seem pretty strong. They're tapped pretty deep, and I think with 6 screws, it's going to work out just fine. Over on the drill press, I can drill the 6 holes I need for the screws, and then the 4 holes I need to tap the 3/8 bolts that I'm going to be using to actually mount the base of the tapping arm to it. I countersink the screws that I'm going to be putting into the magnet so that they'll be nice and flush, and then I'm actually just going to use the tapping arm itself to tap this plate with the 3/8 16 screws that I'll need to bolt the base down to it. Now again, there's a whole video on this thing, but essentially you can see there I've got a drill chuck in it now to do a little bit of deburring, and then I can put a tap and put this vise clamp to my table and basically go ahead and tap those holes. Now there's a clutch built in, which you can see kind of enacting here. This was a pretty dull tap, and I think that's why it wasn't cutting, but basically the clutch keeps you from ever breaking a tap, and now I've got a nice brand new spiral point tap, which is making quick work of this plate, just tapping these threads. It's really, really fast, and I like that you can just sort of move the head around to the part instead of having to move the part to the actual tap. With that done, I can clean off the plate, and you can see the way that I'm going to mount the base to it. Just 4 bolts, and that'll be more than enough. And then I can go ahead and figure out where this thing is going to sit on there and add those screws in. Now right away I noticed some magnetism kind of almost feeling like it was being lost. And at the time I didn't really think too much about it. I put the tapping arm on, I lowered the collar so that I would have a little less leverage, and I just attributed it to the leverage that was being put on this magnet because I guess the base is pretty small. In my mind, though, I figured this was supposed to be a 650-pound lifting magnet, so I'm surprised that I'm able to move it. But that being said, I just kind of continued forward, checked that everything was still square, and then I decided to mask everything up and paint it. I didn't really like the way the yellow looked. I know it sounds a little bit ridiculous, but I decided it would look nicer in black, so I took everything apart and masked off the lifting instructions and the warnings, just because in case I ever did want to return this to being used as a lifting magnet, I didn't want to have any of those warnings missing, and I just rattle canned it with some black spray paint. I made sure not to get any paint on the bottom because I don't want to break any of the magnetic force, and I just sprayed this thing over and made sure nothing would rust. Then I noticed that the magnetism just wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't strong enough, so after I kind of demasked everything and got everything, kind of back together, I did a little experiment. When I put the magnet on the table and I lock it in, I can't move it at all. 650 pounds of grab, it's not going anywhere. When I add that piece of plate on top, it pops right off. So what I think is some of that magnetism is being lost to the plate. So I'm going to make an isolator out of this thick acrylic, and that should solve the problem and get me the maximum amount of grab that I could possibly achieve out of this lifting magnet, which will keep it from potentially popping off the table. My concern isn't that there's going to be so much force on it when I'm using it. It's more that someone could be walking by or I could bump into it while I'm using it and potentially knock it over and break it. This isolator is pretty thick. I think it's 3/4 inch, and it's going to definitely make all the difference that I need to keep that magnetism going downward instead of going upward. And you can see once I get that on there, it goes back to being nice and strong, and now I can't move it. It did lift it up a little bit, but I think by having that collar all the way down, I'm still going to be plenty fine, and this thing is going to be mobile, which is going to be super helpful for me. Now I can give it a shot. I can bang it around. It does move a little tiny bit, but I don't think it's ever going to get hit that hard. And over on my 3/4 inch plate table where this thing normally lives, I think it's going to work out great. You can see the way it still moves around, and because it kind of bows below the machine itself, it can easily get down to that Kurt vise that I've got in there. And here you can see it working, tapping this hole, and overall this thing came out great. I really like the tapping arm, and if you're interested in it, check out my other video. Thanks for watching this one. Check out my Instagram, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I really like how this thing came out. It's going to make it more convenient for me. If you have any tips or questions, leave them down below, and I'll see you on the next one.